Silas Thorne was mending the leak in his roof. Again. A pointless, desperate act, with rotten shingles and hope worn thinner than his threadbare coat. He lived his life by the rules carved into the heart of every soul in the forgotten village of Oakhaven. The rules were simple, unforgiving. He knew the rules. Rule 1. Keep your head down. To be noticed was to be a target for those with more power, and everyone had more power than Silas. Rule 2. Pay your debts, or at least pay the interest. Lord Critch's ledger was the true god of this place, and it was a hungry, merciless god, and especially Rule 3, the oldest and deepest rule of all. Never, ever help an orc. They were monsters, the wild things from the jagged peaks, broken remnants of a fallen age. But when he stumbled through the dripping woods, searching for the fallen branches that were his only shield against the coming cold, he found her. An orc, a warrior, by the look of the broken sword hilt still clutched in her hand. She was collapsed against the roots of an ancient oak, sheltering a small, shivering child. Desperate, dying, and in that moment, with the cold rain plastering his hair to his skull and the ache of hunger a familiar knot in his gut, Silas Thorne broke the most important rule of all. That choice, that single, foolish, compassionate choice. It changed everything. The forest was a place of ghosts for Silas, ghosts of a better time, when his father had taught him the names of the trees and the birds. Now, it was just a larder for the desperate. He gathered firewood with the grim efficiency of a man who knew the precise cost of a cold night. Each snap of a twig under his worn boots was a reminder of his own fragility. He was a dry branch waiting to be broken. The wind carried a sound that did not belong. Not the familiar cry of a nightjar or the rustle of a foraging badger. It was a low sound, a ragged edge of pain trying to smooth itself into a comforting hum. It was the sound of a mother. Silas had not heard such a sound since his own had passed, worn down by the same damp poverty that was now consuming him. He followed it. A foolish act. Curiosity was a luxury, a danger he could not afford. The rules screamed in his head, keep your head down, don't look, don't see. To see was to become responsible, and he had nothing left to give. His own larder was a testament to that. A half loaf of stale bread, a few wrinkled potatoes, and a jar of pickled beets from a summer that felt a lifetime ago. He pushed aside a heavy, wet fern. And there they were. The reality was far worse than the sound. She was huge, even slumped in defeat. Her skin was the color of moss and shadow, a deep, troubled green. Tattoos, stark and black, coiled around one massive bicep, telling a story of battles and lineage he could not read. A gash in her leg, ugly and deep, had bled through the crude leather wrapping. But it was not her own pain that contorted her face. Her entire body was a shield, curled around a small orc child who was shaking with a feverish intensity. The child's breaths were small, shallow rasps. Her eyes, when they finally lifted to meet his, were not the pits of mindless rage the stories described. They were the color of amber, and they were filled with a terrifying, ancient exhaustion and defiance. A silent, desperate plea and a deadly warning, all at once. Her hand, which was missing 2 fingers, tightened on the broken sword. She was a cornered animal, a warrior with no fight left except the last one, the one for her child. Silas froze. Every instinct, every lesson beaten into him by a hard life, screamed at him to back away, slowly, to turn and run back to his leaky hovel and pretend he had seen nothing. This was not his concern. This was a monster from the mountains. Helping her would be a death sentence. If the orc herself didn't kill him, the village would, or Critch would find a way to use it, to add another line of debt to his ledger, one that could only be paid in blood. He saw the child's face small and pinched with cold. He saw the warrior's gaze, not looking at him as a threat, but as the last impossible flicker of hope in a world of darkness. The ache in his own stomach felt suddenly unimportant. The damp chill in his bones was nothing compared to the ice gathering in the small child's limbs. Poverty had taken everything from him, his family, his home, his future. It had scraped him hollow, but it had left one thing behind, one tiny, stubborn, worthless thing, his father's kindness, an inability to walk away from suffering. It was his fatal strength. He took a slow step back, raising his empty hands. The gesture was universal. "I mean no harm." Her eyes narrowed, tracking his every move. The suspicion in them was a physical wall. "The rain," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse. "It will kill the little one." The orc said nothing. She just watched him, her breath a low growl in her chest. She was trying to gather the strength to stand, to fight, to do anything but lie there and wait for the end. He could see the struggle, the war between her warrior pride and her maternal desperation. Silas made a decision. It wasn't a thought. It was a compulsion, a reflex of the soul. He turned his back on her, the most vulnerable position he could take. It was an act of trust he didn't know if he had. He walked a few paces away and began gathering the driest sticks he could find. Piling them into his arm, he did not look back. He could feel her gaze on him, a weight on his spine. He expected the rush of her feet, the sharp final blow. It did not come. When his arms were full, he turned back. He walked slowly toward her and laid the wood on the ground, a small offering. "I have a home," he said, his voice stronger now. "It's not much, the roof leaks, but it is dry. There is a fire." He looked from her defiant eyes to the shivering child. "There is soup." Silence. The only sound was the drip of water from 1,000 leaves and the child's labored breathing. The warrior's gaze flickered from his face to the wood, to the path leading out of the glade. She was weighing the risks, the known danger of the cold against the unknown danger of a human. A weak, strange human offering help when all her life had taught her that humans offered only treachery and steel. Finally, with a groan that seemed to tear from the very earth, she used the flat of her broken sword to push herself up. Her wounded leg buckled, and she caught herself against the tree. Pain flashed in her eyes, but she bit it back. She would not show weakness, not fully. She scooped the child into her arms with an ease that belied her injury. The child whimpered, a small, pathetic sound that cut through Silas's weariness like a knife. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was not agreement. It was a temporary truce, a choice born of absolute necessity. Silas nodded back, a lump forming in his throat. He had just invited the storm into his house. He picked up his own meager bundle of firewood and turned, leading the way through the darkening woods, the heavy, uneven tread of her boots a drumbeat counting down the final moments of his old life. The smell of rain on the dusty path back to his hovel was the smell of a future he could never have imagined. The journey was short, but it felt like an eternity. Each step was a fresh betrayal of the rules that had kept him alive, if not living. His hovel looked even more pathetic than usual as they approached. It was little more than a shack, leaning against the wind as if tired of standing. Smoke, thin and grey, curled from the crooked stone chimney. To Silas, it was a symbol of failure, but to the shivering orc warrior behind him, it was a beacon. He pushed open the creaking door. The inside was one small room, dominated by a stone hearth where a few embers glowed weakly. A cot was pushed against one wall, a rough-spun blanket folded neatly upon it. A small, wobbly table and 2 stools were the only other furniture. The air smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and the faint, sweet scent of poverty's slow decay. Garza, for he would later learn her name was Garza, paused at the threshold. Her amber eyes swept the room, assessing every shadow, every corner. She was a soldier entering hostile territory. Her posture was tense, her body a coiled spring. The child in her arms, Rook, coughed, a dry, rattling sound that echoed in the small space. Silas ignored her suspicion. He moved to the hearth, adding the new wood to the embers and coaxing them back to life with a gentle breath. Flames licked up, casting flickering shadows on the damp stone walls. The room gained a small measure of warmth, a fragile defense against the night. "Here," he said, gesturing to the cot. "Put him down. Let me see to your leg." She hesitated for another long moment. Then, with a deep sigh that seemed to drain the last of her fight, she crossed the room and gently laid the small orc on the cot. Rook was even smaller than Silas had thought, his green skin tinged with a sickly grey. His eyes were closed, his face beaded with sweat despite the chill. Kaza stood guard over the cot, her hand never leaving the hilt of her broken sword. She watched as Silas moved to a small shelf and took down a clean, if patched, rag and a wooden bowl. He filled the bowl with water from a bucket near the door, then placed it on the floor near her. "The wrapping needs to come off," he said softly. "It needs to be cleaned." She looked from his face to the bowl, then down at her leg. Pride warred with pain in her eyes. To accept this help was to admit weakness, to be indebted to this strange, soft human. But the throbbing in her leg was a fire that was consuming her strength, and she needed her strength for Rook. Slowly, painfully, she knelt. Her movements were stiff, her face a mask of controlled agony. She began to unwrap the blood-soaked leather. Silas averted his eyes, giving her a moment of privacy. He busied himself at the hearth, hanging a small blackened pot over the growing fire. He added water from the bucket, then sliced in the last of his potatoes and a single, sad-looking onion. It wasn't much, but it would be hot. It would be something. When he heard a sharp intake of breath, he turned back. The wound was exposed. It was worse than he'd feared. Long and deep, the edges were inflamed and angry. It was a sword cut, clean but untended. Infection was setting in. He knelt in front of her, pushing the bowl of water forward. He didn't speak. He just waited. She stared at him, her gaze intense, searching. What did he want? What was his price? In her world, nothing was free. Kindness was a currency used to purchase betrayal. Silas met her gaze. He had no grand plan, no ulterior motive. He just saw a wound that needed cleaning. He saw a mother trying to save her child. He dipped the rag in the cool water and held it out. With a low growl of resignation, she finally relented. She stretched out her leg. Her muscles were tense, ready to lash out at the first sign of threat. Silas was so close now, he could see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the way her jaw was clenched to hold back the pain. He gently, so gently, began to clean the wound. She flinched, a hiss of pain escaping her lips, but she did not pull away. He worked in silence, his touch surprisingly deft. He was methodical, cleaning away the dirt and dried blood. He had learned a little about wounds from his father, who had served a brief, inglorious stint in the border guard before settling into a life of quiet desperation. As he worked, a strange intimacy settled over the room. The crackle of the fire, the soft rasp of the cloth against her skin, the child's fevered breathing. They were three broken things, huddled together in a broken shack, and for a moment, the world outside, with its rules and its dangers, ceased to exist. When he was finished, he tore another strip from the rag to use as a clean bandage. As he wrapped it, his fingers brushed against the cool metal of something hanging from a leather cord around his own neck. It was his signature item, a rusty iron key. Kaza's eyes, sharp and observant, flickered down to it. A low rumble started in her chest, a sound that might have been a question. Silas finished tying the bandage. He sat back on his heels, feeling the strain in his own back. "It was for my family's home," he said, his voice quiet. He touched the key, the rust a familiar texture against his fingertips. "Before we lost it. To debt." He expected no reaction. It was a human story, a human sorrow. But Garza's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. The concept of a lost home, a place of belonging stolen away, was not exclusively human. She looked from the key to the small hovel around them, then to her child on the cot. She understood. She gave another single, sharp nod. This one was different from the one in the forest. It was not a truce. It was a sliver of understanding, a fragile acknowledgement. They were not the same, but their circumstances rhymed. They were both outcasts fighting for a home that was no longer theirs. The soup was boiling. Silas served it into 2 wooden bowls. He handed one to her. She took it, her large hands dwarfing the small bowl. They sat in silence, eating the thin, watery potato soup. It was the most pathetic meal he had ever served a guest. But as she drank it, the rigid lines of her body seemed to relax, just a little. It was hot. It was sustenance. It was an offering, freely given. In that shared, meager meal, a bond was forged. Not of friendship, not yet, but of mutual desperation and a shared, unspoken recognition. The realization that a monster was just a warrior in a world that had taken everything from her. And a hero was just a man who chose to share his last potato. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Silas's decision, because things were about to get dangerous. The first days were a silent negotiation, a dance of boundaries and needs in the cramped space of the hovel. Garza was a presence as unavoidable as the mountain that loomed over the village. She moved with a contained power, a predator forced into a cage, but her energy was focused entirely on Rook. She barely slept, sitting on a stool by the cot, her hand resting on the child's forehead, her amber eyes tracking his every breath. Silas gave them the cot without a word, taking for himself a thin bedroll on the cold stone floor by the hearth. It was a small sacrifice, but it was all he had to offer. He kept the fire fed. He made more soup, stretching his meager supplies until they were nearly transparent. He shared his last piece of bread with her, breaking it in half and offering her the larger piece. She took it, her gaze unwavering, and then broke her own piece in half again, placing a small crumb into Rook's mouth. The child was too weak to chew, but he swallowed it. It was a sacrament of survival. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Rook's breathing eased, and a faint touch of green returned to his skin. He opened his eyes, and they were clear. He looked at Silas, not with fear, but with a child's simple curiosity. Garza let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a week. The relief that washed over her was so profound it was like watching a statue come to life. For the first time the warrior receded, and only the mother remained. That was when things began to change. With Rook out of immediate danger, Garza's focus expanded. She could not abide the state of their shelter. One morning, Silas awoke to the sound of rhythmic thumping. He sat up, bleary-eyed, to see Garza outside, her wounded leg propped on a log, systematically and brutally splitting his entire woodpile with the back of her broken sword. She swung with an economy of motion that was both terrifying and beautiful. What took him an hour of sweaty, back-breaking labor, she accomplished in minutes. She did not stop there. The leaking roof, his constant, pathetic battle, offended her warrior's sensibility. A shelter should not leak. It was a weakness, a tactical failure. She disappeared into the woods for an hour and returned with wide strips of bark and a sticky, resinous sap. Ignoring Silas's feeble protests, she clambered onto the roof. He watched, his heart in his throat, as her powerful frame moved across the rotten shingles. He expected to hear a crash, to see her plummet through. Instead, he heard only the sounds of methodical repair. By midday, the roof was patched, solidly. That afternoon, it rained, a hard, driving downpour. Silas stood in the middle of his hovel, looking up. Not a single drop fell. A strange feeling bloomed in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It felt like hope. But it was tangled with a new, sharp fear. Her presence was a comfort, a strength he desperately needed. But it was also a beacon, drawing danger closer with every passing day. Their coexistence fell into a rhythm. Silas would forage for what little the late autumn woods had to offer: roots, tough-skinned berries, a few hardy mushrooms he knew were safe. Kaza, with her superior knowledge of the wild, would often follow his path and find twice as much. She showed him which plants had edible tubers, which leaves could be boiled into a bitter but nourishing tea. She set snares with a silent, deadly skill, and soon they had rabbit for their stew. It was a luxury Silas hadn't tasted in a decade. The hovel became less of a shack and more of a home. She used mud and straw to patch the chinks in the walls, blocking the whistling draughts. The room held its warmth now. It was no longer a place to merely survive the night, but a place one could live. I'd live. Rook, growing stronger, would watch them, his large dark eyes following their movements. Silas, remembering the letters his father had taught him, began to draw them in the dirt on the floor. He would point to the A and say the sound, and Rook, after a moment's hesitation, would mimic him. Gaza would watch these lessons, a strange, soft expression on her face. She spoke little, her words blunt and to the point when she did. "More wood," she would say, or, "The water is low." But her actions spoke volumes. One evening, as Silas shivered on his bedroll despite the fire, he awoke to find a heavy pelt laid over him. It was a wolfskin, old and worn, that she had carried on her back. It was one of her few possessions. She had given it to him. He looked over at her, silhouetted by the firelight. She was sharpening the edge of her broken sword on a whetstone she had found in the creek. The metallic scrape was a steady, comforting sound. In that moment, Silas felt a bond deeper than any he had ever known. It was not love, not romance. It was something more fundamental. It was the bond of a pack, a clan, a chosen family of outcasts. He looked at this powerful orc warrior and her child, and he did not see monsters. He saw his family. This fragile piece, this secret world they had built, was not meant to last. Oakhaven was a small village. Secrets had a short lifespan. A child chasing a stray goat too far into the woods saw her. He didn't see a warrior patching a roof or a mother tending her son. He saw a monster, a green-skinned giant from the nightmare stories his grandmother told him. He ran, screaming, back to the village. The news spread like a plague. Fear was a currency in Oakhaven, and everyone was rich with it. It started as whispers in the tavern, then grew to fearful glances cast towards Silas's lonely hovel. The other villagers, who had ignored his poverty for years, now saw him as a threat, a traitor. The fear soon found its master, Hal Critch. He was a man made of ink and anger, his heart a dusty ledger of debts and grievances. He was not a lord in the traditional sense. He had bought the title along with the village's crushing debt from a feckless nobleman decades ago. He was short, paunchy, and always wore a coat that was just a little too fine for the squalor he presided over. He arrived at Silas's door not with guards, but with his ledger, which was far more terrifying. He didn't bother to knock. He simply pushed the door open, the new sturdy door that Gaza had reinforced. Critch blinked, momentarily surprised by the warmth and solidity of the hovel. His piggy eyes scanned the room, taking in the patched walls, the sleeping orc child on the cot, and Gaza, who rose to her full, intimidating height by the hearth. For a second, a flicker of genuine fear crossed Critch's face, but it was quickly replaced by the cold calculus of opportunity. "Thorn," he said, his voice a greasy sneer. He didn't look at Gaza, pretending she wasn't there. It was a deliberate insult, a way of asserting his power. I see you've made some improvements and acquired some livestock. Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Critch and his family. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice was steady. He is not livestock. They are my guests. Critch laughed, a short barking sound devoid of humor. Guests? Thorn, you can't afford to feed yourself, let alone this. He waved a dismissive hand in Garza's direction. But that is not my concern. My concern is the charter, the Oakhaven Charter, which you, as a resident, are bound by. Article 7, Paragraph 3. No resident shall harbor, aid or consort with monstrous creatures, including but not limited to goblins, trolls, and orcs. A clear violation. He opened his ledger. The book was thick, its pages filled with cramped, angry script. He ran a manicured finger down a page. Your debt, Silas, the ancestral debt your grandfather incurred, that your father failed to pay, and that you have so miserably managed. With interest, of course, compounded daily. He looked up, a triumphant glint in his eye. Due to this flagrant violation of the town charter, I have no choice but to invoke the acceleration clause. The full amount is due, immediately. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. The number Critch quoted was astronomical. Impossible. It was more money than the entire village saw in a year. It was a debt designed never to be paid, a tool of perpetual servitude. I can't pay that, Silas stammered. Of course you can't, Critch said smoothly. He closed the ledger with a soft thud. But the charter provides an alternative. Forfeiture of property, this hovel, this worthless patch of land. It will settle a fraction of your account, of course. You will still be in my debt, but you will be homeless. He smiled. And as for your guest, the charter is also clear on that. She is to be handed over to the village militia for judgment. Garza had been silent, her body radiating a tension that made the very air hum. She understood the words orc and judgment. She understood the threat. A low growl rumbled in her chest, the sound of an avalanche starting high on a mountain. You will leave, Silas said. His voice was quiet, but it held a core of iron that surprised even himself. This is my home. Critch's eyes widened in mock surprise. Your home? According to my ledger, this is my property. You are merely a tenant, a delinquent tenant. He pointed a fat finger at Garza. Get rid of it, and I might be persuaded to renegotiate your payment schedule. If not, he let the threat hang in the air. I will be back, with the militia, in 3 days. He turned and walked out, leaving the door open to the cold air. The warmth of the room seemed to flee with him. Silas stood, trembling, not from fear, but from a white-hot rage. He had spent his entire life being crushed under the weight of that ledger. He had accepted it as a fact of life like the rain or the cold. But now it was not just his life at stake. He looked at Garza. The warrior was back, her face a mask of stone. But her eyes were fixed on him. She had seen him, a weak, physically unimposing human, stand up to the man who held all the power. She had seen him stand up for her, for them. The bond between them deepened, no longer just a fragile thread of shared circumstance, but a thick cable of loyalty. He had declared them a family. He had named the hovel his home, with them in it. He had chosen, and now the consequences of that choice were coming for them. The world was about to fall on their heads. Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below. Would you have opened your door? But hold on, because Howl Critch wasn't finished yet. The 3 days Critch had given them were a suffocating shroud. The village, once a place of quiet neglect, became openly hostile. Children who used to ignore Silas now threw stones at his hovel. their parents watching from a safe distance with a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. The path to the woods became a gauntlet of hateful stares. No one would sell him supplies, not even for the few copper coins he had saved. They were isolated. An island of defiance in a sea of prejudice. Inside the hovel, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Gaza was a caged beast. She paced the small floor, her heavy boots, wearing a path in the packed earth. Every creak of a branch, every distant shout, sent her hand flying to her broken sword. She knew what a village militia was, a mob with rusty pitchforks and misplaced courage. She could kill a dozen of them before they brought her down, but she would be brought down. And Rook. What would happen to Rook? "We should leave," she said on the second night, her voice a low rasp. "Go back to the mountains. They will not follow us there." Silas looked at Rook, who was sleeping peacefully on the cot, the wolf pelt tucked under his chin. He had started to smile. He was learning to trust. Then Silas looked at the roof, the solid, leak-proof roof that Gaza had built. He looked at the walls, sealed against the wind. "This is our home," he said, his voice stubborn. "I will not be driven from another home." "This is not a home," she countered, her voice harsh with desperation. "It is a trap, a tomb." "No," Silas insisted, touching the rusty key that still hung around his neck. "A home is not a place. It's a choice. To stand. To protect." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "You fix the roof. I will fix this." She stared at him, baffled by his illogical, suicidal resolve. He was a scribe, a creature of paper and ink. He had no strength, no weapon. How could he possibly fix the arrival of a mob? But his certainty was a strange, unshakable force. It was the same iron will he'd shown to Critch, a strength she was beginning to recognize as more formidable than mere muscle. But Critch was only the local threat, the rot in the heart of the village. A far greater danger was approaching, drawn by whispers on the wind. News traveled far, even to the jagged peaks where the Orc clans dwelled. A deserter, a female warrior named Gaza, seen in the company of a human near Oak Haven. This news reached the ears of Thrathrak Skullrender. He was the warlord Gaza had fled. A new breed of Orc leader who valued power over honor, gold over loyalty. He ruled through fear, and Gaza's desertion was a challenge to his authority that could not go unanswered. She had not just fled, she had defied him. She had witnessed his corruption, and she had taken something he wanted back. Thrathrak arrived at Oak Haven on the third day, the very day Critch's ultimatum was set to expire. He did not come with an army, but with a dozen of his most brutal warriors, their armor a patchwork of iron and bone, their faces grim and merciless. They rode into the village square like a storm front, their massive, shaggy mounts kicking up dust and panic. The villagers scattered, bolting their doors, peering through cracks in the shutters. This was not a storybook monster. This was a warlord, radiating an aura of casual violence that made the air itself feel thin. Hal Critch, however, saw not a threat, but an opportunity, a solution to his problem. He scurried out of his office, his ledger tucked under his arm, a fawning, obsequious smile on his face. He approached the warlord, bowing low. "Mighty Lord Thrathrak," Critch began, his voice slick with grease. "Welcome to Oak Haven. We are a humble, peaceful village." Thrathrak looked down at him from his mount, his lip curled in a sneer that exposed a row of sharpened teeth. One of his eyes was a milky white orb, the other a chip of obsidian. "I am not here for your village, grub." His voice was like grinding stone. "I am hunting. A deserter. A thief. I am told she is here." Critch's smile widened. "Ah, yes. The monster. A terrible burden on our community, I assure you. I was just preparing the militia to deal with her." He gestured with a flourish. "Allow me to guide you. She is being harbored by a fool, a debtor named Silas Thorne, in a shack at the edge of the woods. Thrathrak grunted, a sound of satisfaction. His gaze swept over the terrified village. "Your militia can stand down. This is orc business." He spurred his mount and his war band trotted through the empty street, their heavy armor jingling, the sound of their boots and hooves a death knell. Critch scurried along beside them, eager to witness the bloody resolution. The entire village watched, a silent, fearful audience. The sound reached the hovel first, the rhythmic thud of heavy boots, the snort of a warhorse. Kaza went pale, a shade of grey under her green skin. This was not the shambling militia. This was a sound she knew, a sound from her nightmares. "Thrathrak," she whispered, her voice tight with a terror Silas had never heard before. She grabbed Rook from the cot, holding him close. Her eyes were wide with panic. "We are dead." The hovel was surrounded. Through the small, grimy window, Silas could see them. Hulking figures in dark iron, they radiated a menace that made the village militia seem like angry children. At the forefront was the warlord, a giant of an orc with a cruel, scarred face, and next to him, practically vibrating with smug triumph, was Howl Critch. "Gaza!" Thrathrak's roar shook the very walls of the hovel. "You are caught. Come out and face your judgment. Your death will be swift. The child I will take back. He will be taught what happens to the children of traitors." Gaza let out a choked cry. It was her worst fear. Not her own death, but what would become of Rook. Critch stepped forward, brandishing his ledger like a holy text. "And Thorn, your time is up. The property is forfeit. Come out and surrender the orc, and your miserable life may be spared." It was over. Trapped between a bloodthirsty warlord and a greedy bureaucrat, there was no escape. The flimsy door would not hold for a second. The patched walls would offer no protection. Silas looked at Gaza's terrified face. He looked at the trembling child in her arms. He looked at the home they had built together. The anger inside him burned away the fear. It was a pure, cold rage. He would not let them be destroyed. He would not let his family be torn apart. He walked to the door. Gaza grabbed his arm, her grip like iron. "No, Silas! They will kill you." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a fire in his eyes that matched her own. "A home is a choice," he said, his voice ringing with a strange power. "To stand. To protect." He gently removed her hand from his arm. He took a deep breath, and then the weak, quiet, outcast human, Silas Thorne, opened the door and walked out to face the warlords of his world. The air outside was cold. The assembled orcs and the smirking face of Howl Critch were a wall of impending violence. The entire village was a gallery of silent, watching eyes. They expected him to beg, to grovel. He did neither. Silas Thorne, a man who had spent his life trying to be invisible, stood in the center of it all. He was physically small, unimpressive, his clothes little more than rags. He held no weapon, but he stood with the stillness of a mountain. Thrathrak laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "This is the human who defies me? A worm. Step aside, worm, before I tread on you." Silas did not look at the warlord. Instead, he turned his gaze on Howl Critch. "You speak of ledgers and laws," Silas said, his voice clear and carrying in the tense silence. "You speak of debts. Let us speak of debts." Critch blinked, thrown off balance. This was not the script he had imagined. "Your debt is absolute, Thorn. The law is the law." "Is it?" Silas's voice rose, filled with a passion no one had ever heard from him. "What is the debt a leader owes his people? What is the debt a village owes its own? For years I have starved in this hovel, and you have demanded interest. My neighbors have watched me waste away and offered nothing. That is a debt of compassion unpaid." He turned his gaze, sweeping it over the watching villagers. They flinched, some looking away in shame. You call her a monster. But when my roof leaked, she fixed it. When my fire was cold, she brought wood. When my belly was empty, she hunted. She has paid more into this community in a week than any of you have in a lifetime. Who, then, is the monster? A murmur went through the crowd of onlookers. They had not thought of it that way. Silas finally turned to face Thrathrak. The warlord was no longer laughing. He was watching Silas with a new, dangerous intensity. "And you," Silas said, his voice dropping, becoming colder. "You call yourself a warlord, a leader. You hunt a warrior who fled your protection. You threaten her child. Is that honor? Is that strength? Or is it the desperate act of a tyrant who fears the truth she carries?" "Silence, human!" one of Thrathrak's warriors snarled, stepping forward. "No!" Thrathrak commanded, raising a hand. He dismounted, his massive frame seeming to suck the very light from the air. He stalked towards Silas, his obsidian eye fixed on the human's face. "You speak of truth. A worm like you knows nothing of orcish truth, of honor. I know that honor is not a word you write in a ledger, and it is not a title you take by force," Silas shot back, unflinching as the giant orc loomed over him. "It is a choice, the same choice I made when I opened my door to a mother and her sick child. A choice you have never made." This was the moment, the turning point, as Thrathrak raised a massive, gauntleted fist to smash the insolent human into the dirt. The hovel door opened again. Gaza stepped out. She was no longer the terrified mother. She was a queen. She had placed Rook safely back inside. Her shoulders were back, her head held high. In her hands, she held not her broken sword, but a heavy leather sack. She walked to stand beside Silas, a silent, powerful statement. "We stand together." She looked at Howl Critch, her amber eyes burning with contempt. "You speak of debt," she said, her voice a low, powerful rumble. She reached into the sack and pulled out a single, heavy gold coin, stamped with an unfamiliar, ancient crest. She threw it at his feet. It landed in the mud with a rich, definitive thud. "The human's debt. It is paid. Now choke on your ledger and be gone." Critch's eyes bulged. The coin was worth more than Silas's entire fabricated debt. It was more gold than he had seen in his life. He scrambled for it, his greed overriding all else. Gaza ignored him. Her attention was solely on Thrathrak. "You call me a thief," she said, her voice ringing out for all to hear, orc and human alike. "I am no thief. I am a purveyor of justice." She upended the sack. Gold coins, gems, and priceless artifacts spilled onto the muddy ground. A river of impossible wealth. But it was not the gold that made Thrathrak's warriors gasp. It was what lay among it. Gaza reached down and picked up a heavy iron torque, simple and unadorned, but radiating an ancient power, the chieftain's torque of the Shattered Peak clan, the true symbol of leadership passed down for generations. "You speak of honor, Thrathrak Skull Render," Gaza boomed, holding the torque aloft. "But you are a thief and a liar. This is the war chest of our clan. Wealth you stole from our people, hoarding it for yourself while our elders starved. You told us it was lost in the human wars." She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at him. "I served you. I believed in you, until I saw you trading our sacred honor blades for human wine, until I saw you leave our wounded to die because they were a drain on resources. I did not desert. I reclaimed what was stolen from my people." A shocked silence fell over the warband. Their eyes darted from the undeniable proof glittering in the mud, to the sacred torque in Gaza's hand, to the face of their warlord. Thrathrak's face was a mask of fury and panic. "She lies! Kill her! Kill them all!" But his warriors did not move. They looked at each other. They had seen the truth of Gaza's words in Thrathrak's actions for months. The hoarded supplies, The pointless, costly battles, the disrespect for their traditions. Silas's words about leadership and honor echoed in their minds. And now, the proof was at their feet. One warrior, a grizzled veteran with a scarred face, looked at the talk in Gaza's hand, then at Thrathrak. He slowly, deliberately, dropped the haft of his axe into the mud, a gesture of defiance. Another followed, and another. Within moments, the entire warband had turned their backs on their warlord. Their loyalty, a thing Thrathrak thought he owned, had been given to the one who showed true honor. The one who stood with a weak human to protect her child. The one who held their stolen past in her hand. Thrathrak was alone. His power, built on fear and lies, had crumbled into dust. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Thrathrak, stripped of his power and his war band, did not fight. He screamed curses and threats, but they were the hollow sounds of a king with no kingdom. His former warriors bound him, not with cruelty, but with a grim finality. They did not kill him, that was not their way. Instead, they exiled him, sending him into the wilderness with nothing but his own dishonor for company, a fate worse than death for an orc. Then, the veteran warrior who had first defied him knelt before Gaza. He did not kneel to her as a subject, but as a follower. "The talk has chosen," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The clan has a leader again." One by one, the other warriors knelt. They pledged their loyalty not to a warlord, but to a chieftain, to Gaza. In the village, the shift was just as seismic. Hal Critch, still clutching his single gold coin, tried to assert his authority, blustering about laws and militia. But no one was listening. The villagers had seen everything. They had seen Silas's courage and Gaza's honor. They had seen Critch's greed and cowardice laid bare. When he tried to order the militia to seize the rest of the treasure, the blacksmith, a man twice Critch's size, simply took the ledger from his hands and tossed it into a puddle. "Your rule here is over, Critch," the blacksmith said, his voice a low rumble that spoke for the entire village. "We'll deal with our own debts from now on." The crowd murmured in agreement. The spell of the ledger was broken. Gaza, now a chieftain with a loyal warband and a clan's fortune at her command, did not seek revenge. She sought to build. She took a handful of coins from the treasure, a tiny fraction of its worth, and walked to the village elder. She didn't just pay off Silas's debt. She bought the hovel and the surrounding acres of woodland outright. The deed was written on fresh parchment, signed by the elder, and witnessed by the entire village. It was a new law, written in the ink of respect, not servitude. The hovel, once a symbol of Silas's poverty, became the foundation of something new. Gaza's warriors, skilled craftsmen in their own right, began to work. They tore down the rotten parts of the shack, but they kept the hearth. They kept the wall that Gaza had first patched with mud and straw. Around it, they built a new house, strong and sturdy, with thick timber walls and a proper stone foundation. The villagers, hesitant at first, began to help. The blacksmith offered to forge new tools. The farmer's wife brought loaves of fresh bread. The children, no longer throwing stones, watched in wide-eyed wonder as humans and orcs raised a home together. They were building more than a house. They were building a bridge. The old rule, never help an orc, was dead and buried. A new one was being written. Different does not mean enemy. A new community began to form at the edge of the woods, a place for outcasts. Other orcs, hearing of a true chieftain who valued honor, began to trickle down from the mountains. Humans from Oakhaven, tired of a life of scraping by under Critch's thumb, came to join them, offering their skills in exchange for a fair share. It was a settlement built on mutual respect, a testament to the choice made on a cold, rainy day. Months later, Silas stood on the porch of the new house. It was a real house, warm and solid. The air smelled of fresh-cut pine and baking bread. Rook, no longer small and sickly, chased a laughing human child through the new grass. His orcish strength matched by the child's nimble speed. Gaza came to stand beside him. She was no longer just a warrior or a chieftain. She was a leader, her presence a source of calm strength for all. She looked out at the burgeoning community, a smile touching her lips. Silas looked at the rusty iron key that now hung on a nail by the new, strong door. It was no longer a symbol of a home he had lost, but a reminder of the home he had built. A home forged not from wood and stone, but from compassion and courage. He was no longer Silas Thorne, the debtor, the outcast. Here he was Silas, the teacher, the advisor, the friend. In standing up for Gaza, he had found his own strength. In giving her a home, he had become king of his own castle. Gaza followed his gaze to the key. "A small thing," she said, her voice soft. "It opened the door," Silas replied, looking at her. His heart was full. He had been a man with nothing, but now he had everything that mattered. A family, a home, a future. That's all that matters. She placed a heavy, comforting hand on his shoulder. They stood together, watching the sun set over their shared world, a world they had built from the ashes of their broken past, a world where a human and an orc were simply family. And that is how a poor human and an honorable orc proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.